Rationality and psychology in foreign policy decision making is an interesting topic because it looks at different theories, borrowing it from different social sciences as well as the behavioral sciences in identifying of what decision makers deliberate, what they have at their disposal, and to what extent are they really constrained in their decision making. If you look at the presumption that rationality is the overriding factor causing policymakers to make decisions, some scholars are uneasy with that. They say the very idea of making decisions, policies, there's some sort of assumption or prerequisite that you have control over the events. Rational choice model is really a straitjacket for some social scientists because it imposes a rich diversity of human motives and interaction. We have too much of a assumption of calculation, a lot of assumption on quantitative impact. There's really a difference in scholarship looking at positivists and post-positivists, those who measure stuff, and those looking at constructivists would certainly be post-positivist, that we have different factors which come into play. So realism, we've learned, privileges national security as criterion for state decision makers, whereas the rational actor, he'll refer to the state as the unitary decision maker. So realism doesn't probe into what's happening inside the state, what the decision-making process itself is. It's that black box. And constructivism, again, is on the other side here, saying that interest, preferences, identity, values, religion, all of these things cannot be taken as a given. They shape foreign policy, they shape individuals, and ultimately they shape decisions. And it affects everything from foreign policy making to the whole spectrum of international relations. Now, looking at the idea of rationality, we're looking at four poles: procedure versus substantive, individual versus the collective, efficiency versus democracy, and normative and positive. The distinction between procedure and substance, the procedural rationality and substantive rationality, is that procedural rationality occurs when an actor engages in a sort of systematic process of deliberation, of thinking. You're given a particular problem issue. What can you do? What sources can you employ? Tools of statecraft, of tools of power, in order to fix that, solve that particular issue. So the focus here is identifying best means to optimize the outcome. So looking at Reagan's covert support for the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. He was unable to balance against the Soviets through conventional means. He couldn't have attacked the Soviets with US forces. So the most effective way for the US government at the time was to go through proxy, war by proxy, which was to arm the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. Now, in the long term, that certainly had, negative impact on U.S. national security, but in the short term, that was seen as the best way to get the Soviets out of Afghanistan, or at least to make them bleed as much as possible. Looking at Obama's decision to send Navy SEALs to get Bin Laden, again, Obama was subject to different counsel, including missile strikes, but that was seen in terms of procedural rationality as the best possible course of action. Because they could positively ID Bin Laden, either than assassinate him, kill him, or in fact take him to a US court. Substantive rationality is very different. It tells us what is the correct outcome. So again, there is no deliberation process. There's only one particular option available. So looking at Russia, it was the only option for Russia to throw itself at the mercy of the IMF at the end of the 90s. Czechoslovakia could have resisted Hitler in 1938 despite loss of Anglo-French support, but that would have been hardly rational. US diplomacy towards Germany's reunification in 1989, there was some in the British government were uneasy about unification of Germany, but what would happen? Would Germany dominate Europe again? But for the United States, as the champion of balancing against the Soviet Empire, there was no other way but to support unification of Germany in 1989. The same was true for the US in the Arab Spring in 2011, when you had all these Arab protesters across the Middle East protest lack of democracy and lack of human rights and dignity. And Obama then compared them to the Boston Patriots and fully supported what they were doing. So again, there was no other outcome. The United States being the self-proclaimed beacon of freedom, of human rights and democracy, there was no other way, given the importance of that movement for the US to support it. The individual and the collective. So the question is, where do we pitch rationality? Is it the individual or is it a group? Here, the rationality really epitomizes the general problem of agency and foreign policy. So in looking at all individuals involved, politicians, bureaucrats, have a dilemma of how to act rationally in terms of personal interest, identity, loyalty, and professional responsibility. So we looked at that in particular, bureaucratic politics, standard operating procedures, and different modules in this course. Group action and foreign policy, if you compare it to private business, in a private firm, we have a goal which is profit, growth, cohesiveness, and everybody works towards that. That is not the case amongst foreign policymakers in government. Goals can be multiple, can be sometimes contradictory, very complex, and subject to many different opinions. Many different bureaucratic hurdles have to be overcome here. Efficiency versus democracy. So again, you could say a constitutional democratic state has always is somewhat disadvantaged of authoritarian states in terms of how efficient they can do things, because they have one hand tied behind their backs when dealing with those autocratic states. Now, again, the flip side of the coin here is that democratic debate makes for stronger and for more resilient foreign policy in the long run. We looked at on the module on Congress and the president, if there's a true debate, there's a consensus between the executive and the legislative, if that's the product of that, that makes actually for more resilient, potentially for more successful foreign policy. We saw that Afghanistan was always the good war, whereas Iraq was the war of choice, lacked popular legitimacy. Afghanistan was never subject to that sort of criticism the Iraq war was subject to. So again, that certainly always has an impact on foreign policy implementation. Normative versus positive. So again, the very notion of rationality carries a particular view of the world, sometimes contestable view of the world. So the emphasis on flexible choices between options which can be ranked. So I'll be looking at the decision tree, what sort of preferences are being optimal for our national interest. That doesn't necessarily apply to all societies with different religious, cultural, historical frameworks, and even in the West there's a different a debate and disagreement about how big a risk might be run by neglecting the dicta of rationality. So again, constructivists would say, well, we rely on assets like intuition, leadership, pragmatism, more so than looking at a decision tree and really being bound by that particular spectrum. This would take us to the concept of bounded rationality. So actual foreign policy making seems to fall short of true rationality. So we looked at different bureaucratic pathologies in it. If you're looking at bounded rationality, we see that it is difficult even for the hegemon to reshape the entire system. So statesmen here are seen as canoeists. They follow the flow, they go down the river, they avoid the rocks, they don't set their own direction, they go with the current, they certainly don't go upstream. So the muddling through is something which is a term which originates from the literature on bounded rationality, that you don't set the agenda, you don't want to have a dramatic reshaping of the international system. Even the United States, even the hegemon can't do it. So here the notion is of muddle through. The statesman is the canoeists. Now moving on to the psychological factor, we have one Adorno's theory of the authoritarian personality and Weber's account of the magical semi-religious appeal. Adorno's theory here is the claim is that certain personalities display symptoms of personal intellectual rigidity, which advances them in positions of power, political power, but then also damages their performance in power. So they tend to be hierarchical, dominant, but also very uncritical of those above them. So Nixon, Thatcher, Kohl, Cheney, Trump certainly would very much fall in that ethnocentric, and they're unable to cope with non-conformity. The semi-religious is kind of filling a political, emotional vacuum in mass politics. So JFK, Che Guevara, Thatcher, Mandela, Gorbachev, Nasser of Egypt, Khomeini, Willy Brandt, West Germany, and Obama would fall within that particular category. Now, one of the most important aspects in the psychology literature is perception and misperception. So again, the difference between how we view the world and how the world, how events are actually happen independent of our own perception. Now, again, if you have a certain view of the world, and everybody has that by fact, they were born in a certain society, education, parents, social surrounding, all of that, religion, your own identity, your own ideology, all of these things. If you like it, if you don't want to admit it or not, certainly affects of how you see the world. Once established, they change very, very slowly. So if an actor has no choice but to change an image overnight, that can be politically catastrophic. I'll give you an example in a second. Misperception intention is easy to exaggerate both enmity and alliance. That really looks at, that we do overestimate enemies or perceived enemies in time of peace, and we underestimate them in the time of war. So again, looking at Neville Chamberlain, he came back from Munich in 1938. He declared that we have achieved peace of our time. When it was obvious that he had too benign an attitude of Hitler, Chamberlain fell from office within 9 months. Same is true for Stalin, non-aggression pact between Stalin and Hitler. After Germany invaded the Soviet Union, allegedly Stalin was in paralyzed shock for 3 days. We couldn't believe that his perception of Hitler, in fact, was completely false. You can see here on that rather famous picture, you can either see a young woman turning her head to the right, or old woman. So here you would see the eyelashes of the young woman, the nose, side of the face, hair, head, and that would be the old woman. Old woman. These would be the eyes, the big nose, the long chin, and the mouth. Now again, this is the cognitive foreign policy model, that you have these mental shortcuts, other processes, and you're unable, once you have established them, it is difficult to change. Now again, some of examples of looking at human intuition, looking at what it comes down to are decisions by individuals further down the rank. Duty officer Stanislav Petrov, he's largely responsible. The fact that we're all still alive today, had it not been for him, the US and the Soviet Union would have gone to nuclear war in 1983. He was the duty officer at defense, Soviet ballistic missile defense system. The system did alert that the US had just launched a missile. He said the siren howled, but I just sat there for a few seconds staring at the big backlit red screen with the word launch on it. A minute later, the siren went off again. The second missile was launched, then the third and the fourth and the fifth. Computers changed their alerts from launch to missile strike. Now, had he believed that this was not a malfunction, that the US had in fact launched a missile against the Soviet Union, he would have had to alert the headquarters, tell them that a missile launch had occurred, and the missile headquarters would have retaliated against the United States, which of course then would have caused the United States to actually have a missile launch. So it really was, of course, a computer system failure. He was the only officer in the team with a civilian education. He had a lot of doubt, even though the computer said there is no doubt that the US had in fact launched. He had his doubt, and he called the headquarters and said there was a computer malfunction. And that certainly not only saved the day, but saved humankind. The other one was 2013 in the United States, the inspection of the 91st Missile Wing at Minute Air Force Base in North Dakota. The crew earned a D when tested on the mastery of Minuteman III missile launch operations. After that, 17 officers were removed from the highly sensitive duty of standing 24 hours watch over the Air Force nuclear missiles in North Dakota. So again, if you're looking at the big picture of nuclear deterrence, it comes down to the capability and the perception, misperception, and of course the cognitive salience of members of the armed forces, in that case officers in Air Force Base in North Dakota. This theory of cybernetic decision making very much fits in that the claim is that the human mind cannot possibly cope with the mass of information and develops a repertoire for monitoring only a very limited number of variables. So again, looking at the US during the Second World War was obsessed with looking at sabotage, internal sabotage by Japanese, and it did not see it as viable or possible that the Japanese would launch an aerial attack against the US in the Pacific theater. Konrad Adenauer, he was largely determined to locate West Germany within the Western Alliance, and as such, he completely ignored anything else, looking at particular relations with East Germany and the Soviet Union. And then looking at that picture, Death by PowerPoint, that was McChrystal, who said once we've understood that slide, we'll have won the war. If you look at all these different variables needed for counterinsurgency, so that's coin dynamics, you can see that makes sense. You know, populations, conditions and beliefs, popular support, insurgents, the relevance and the factor of narcotics, the infrastructure, tribal governance. But it gives you the illusion of understanding, it gives you the illusion of control, that you're in control. And certainly NATO, the United States, had never been fully in control of Afghanistan, and certainly did not achieve what they thought they would achieve in over a decade of occupation in Afghanistan. So again, that is very much the idea that we in control, we understand, where in fact there's so many things happening independent of your own perception, of your own belief system, that you're not in charge. This would lead us to the power of historical thinking, that decision makers inherit criteria, dominant rituals, pieces of conventional thinking, which they use and abuse. So Hegel said we learn from history that we do not learn from history. So again, looking at appeasement, genocide, Versailles Peace, Bay of Pigs, Suez, Great Crash, all of these things are not unique. They have popped up in different forms across throughout the 20th century. So again, we have to be really strike a balance between obsessed and completely consumed by the past, as well as completely ignoring of what's happening. And then, of course, we also have this, that government officials do have very little regard for the scientific research presented to them. And that would be a good case study on the Iraq War. There was complete failure of deterrence. Whatever the United States did after Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in 1990, the US failed to do so before the invasion of Kuwait. So again, there was no credible strategy of deterrence and reassurance prior to 1990. So again, this gives you kind of to recap, what is coercive diplomacy? Well, you have to communicate what you demand of the opponent to do or not to do, whether and how to create the adversary's mind a sense of urgency about complying with the demand, how to create a sufficiently credible threat of punishment, and whether to couple the threatened punishment with positive inducement. So again, even though it was very obvious in history how deterrence works and what is needed for deterrence, the US completely failed to establish a deterrent posture towards Iraq. So if you look at all the constraints, looking at rationality, the literature on psychology, it's almost absurd to expect rational decision makers to act rationally. Now, certainly leaders think that they're governed by reason. What we can see is that spectrum, that most governments set broad strategic directions within which bureaucratic and domestic politics takes place. Now, again, looking at modernity, which the West has exported globally, we are very distrustful of chance, superstition, and fate, and we put a premium on the ability to control actions and the environment. And that, you can see, is the debate between behavioral scientists and constructivists when it comes to foreign policy. Do enjoy the quiz on the psychology of foreign policy decision making.